He told his daughter he had no money, and she left him a note that broke his heart. A boy never asked for anything. He only wanted to work honestly and take care of his loved ones. What he did not imagine was that life, after so many losses, had an impossible gift in store for him. This is the story of a humble young man, a daughter with an immense heart, and an ending that will touch your soul. The sun had not yet fully risen over the rusted rooftops of the San Lorenzo neighborhood when Julian Reyes stepped into the alley carrying the old wooden box in which he kept ice pops. The city was just beginning to shake off its slumber, but the young man was already walking along the cracked sidewalks with steady steps, dodging potholes, stray dogs, and cars that roared impatiently in the shadows of dawn. His shoes, worn down to the soles, made a dull sound against the pavement dampened by the morning dew. The man had only eaten a piece of bread the night before, but his empty stomach weighed less than the responsibility he carried on his shoulders. Every morning was the same. He woke up without needing an alarm, washed his face with the cold water dripping from the broken faucet in the sink, and went out to sell popsicles between the market stalls and Metrobus stops. Sometimes he came back with just a few coins, other times with frozen fingers from not having sold a single one, but Julian never complained. "That's what we're alive for," his mother, Doña Carmen, used to say while handing him a clean towel or warming up some cinnamon coffee when they managed to gather a little extra for breakfast. The woman's face was marked with wrinkles not from age, but from years battered by poverty and hardship. The house where they lived was a tin-roofed room at the back of a shared lot. They had no private bathroom or running water all day. The kitchen consisted of a brazier and a rickety table, but everything was clean and orderly. Doña Carmen was strict about cleanliness, even though she had nothing more than an old rag and a bucket to sweep the dirt floor. That morning, Julian walked past the market, heading toward the office area in Mixcoke. He knew that there, among the hurried office workers, he might be able to sell some popsicles if the heat helped. He wore a short-sleeved t-shirt, but sweat was already soaking his back. The sun had already climbed over the buildings, and the city, with its eternal noise, devoured his steps. Outside an OXO store, he stopped to drink water from a bottle he kept in his backpack. As he did, he noticed a man with a white beard and a cane waiting for the bus. His appearance gave him away: old but ironed clothes, thick-framed glasses, and a notebook in hand. He was not a homeless man, but he did not look like an executive either. The old man noticed his gaze and nodded politely. "Good morning," he said in a soft voice that contrasted with the surrounding bustle. "Good morning, sir," the young man replied, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The man smiled and stepped closer. "Popsicles? What flavors do you have?" he asked. "Tamarind, eggnog, and rice pudding," he said, pulling one out with a mechanical gesture. The old man asked for a tamarind one, paid the exact amount, and brought it to his mouth with an almost childlike expression. He chewed the ice slowly, as if savoring a gourmet dish. "They're better than the ones at the university," he commented. Julian barely smiled. He thanked him with a gesture and was about to keep walking. But the man stopped him with an unexpected question. "Do you work every day?" "Yes, sir. Since I was 12, he answered while adjusting the lid of his box. "And your mother?" asked the man. "She doesn't work anymore. She hurt her back a few years ago," the boy said, lowering his gaze. The old man remained silent for a few seconds. He watched the traffic, then looked at the young man and seemed to make a decision. "My name is Horacio Santillan. I live in Coyoacan. I have a big house I can't take care of anymore. If you're ever interested in more stable work, go to this address," he said, handing him a wrinkled card. Julian took it without much conviction. Over the years, he had heard too many empty promises. "Thank you," he said respectfully. "I mean it," the man insisted, pointing to the address with his cane. "This is not charity. I need someone trustworthy, and you seem to know what it means to earn your bread." The bus arrived, and Don Horacio boarded without saying anything else. Julian put the card away without reading it and kept walking under the sun, unaware that his life had just changed forever. That night, his mother made lentils with rice and placed the tortillas on a clean cloth, as she did every time she wanted dinner to feel like a hug. Julian came home more tired than usual, with slumped shoulders and downcast eyes, but he sat with the same patience as always, helping his mother serve while telling her the little he had sold. "What's that paper?" she asked, pointing to the card he had taken out of his pocket along with the coins. "An address from a man who bought a popsicle from me. He says he has a job for me," Julian replied, placing the card next to the plate and rubbing his neck with his right hand. Doña Carmen fell silent for a few seconds. Her fingers stopped halfway to bringing the spoon to her mouth. Her expression turned serious, as if there was something about that piece of paper she didn't quite like. "What kind of job?" she asked, still holding the spoon but not taking a bite. "I don't know. Maybe taking care of his house. He lives in Coyoacan," he said, breaking a tortilla with his fingers without raising his eyes. She took the card from his hands gently. She read it in silence, pressing her lips together. Then, she placed it on the table slowly and lowered her gaze to her plate, stirring the rice with the spoon as if searching for an answer among the grains. "Don't go alone, Julian. If you decide to go, take me with you," she said in a low but firm voice, like when she gave orders disguised as advice. The young man nodded without thinking. He raised his head, looked at her for a few seconds, then respectfully lowered his gaze again. His mother was all he had, and even though she could no longer work, she remained the compass that guided his every step. That night, while they slept under a tin roof and the distant noise of night buses crossed the avenue, Julian thought again about the old man's offer. Something inside told him it wasn't a trap, but the learned distrust from years of hardship told him not to trust so easily. He had seen too much not to be wary. Even so, amid the sound of light rain starting to fall on the rusty roof, he closed his eyes with his mind made up. The next day, he would go knock on that door, not out of ambition, but for something older, more necessary: hope. The neighborhood where Don Horacio lived moved at a different pace. The streets were lined with tall trees whose roots had lifted the sidewalks, as if trying to escape the earth itself. The air smelled of jacaranda and coffee, and cars passed slowly, without the impatient clamor of the neighborhoods in the northern part of the city. Julian wore nothing but his usual clean clothes, a backpack with a poorly written resume, and an attentive gaze, as if everything around him might vanish if he didn't watch it carefully enough. At his side, his mother walked with short steps, her sandals hitting the concrete with a hollow sound. They walked in silence, but not out of discomfort. They were measuring the moment, like someone entering foreign land. The house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by a black stone wall and a weathered wooden gate that opened to a garden larger than their entire neighborhood. There was no doorbell, only an iron knocker that Julian tapped timidly, glancing at his mother as if asking for approval. A few minutes later, a petite woman in a beige uniform appeared at the entrance, wiping her hands on her apron as she looked at them with kind curiosity. "Are you looking for Mr. Santillan?" she asked, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, ma'am. He gave me this card," the young man said, handing it to her carefully, as if it were a promise. The woman took it, nodded without another word, and disappeared down a hallway lined with flower pots. The bird song filtered through the tall trees, and the air carried the persistent scent of jasmine. Julian felt his hands trembling slightly, but he stood firm. It wasn't fear, it was the weight of possibility. When Don Horacio appeared, he was wearing a light linen shirt and loose-fitting pants barely held up by a frayed belt. He walked, supported by his cane, slow but upright, and his gaze remained steady. "So you decided to come," he said with a half smile, stopping in front of them. "Yes, sir, I wanted to know more about the job," Julian replied, squaring his shoulders without letting go of the backpack. The old man nodded slowly, then turned toward the woman who accompanied him. "Is she your mother?" he asked, squinting against the sunlight. "Yes, sir. Her name is Carmen," he said, lowering his voice instinctively out of respect. "Please, come in," said the man, making a broad gesture with his free hand. The living room was filled with books, old photographs, and furniture coated in decades of dust. A cabinet held curious objects, pocket watches, rusty compasses, yellowed letters. The walls were adorned with genre paintings, indigenous faces, and landscapes of colonial towns. The man sat with difficulty in a wide armchair, took a deep breath before speaking, and offered them a seat with a slight wave of the hand. Julian and Doña Carmen obeyed, sitting on the edge of the couch without daring to lean back. "This house is too big for me. My wife died years ago, and I had no children," Don Horacio said, staring at a fixed point on the carpet. "My only company is Clara, the woman who opened the door, but she's old too. I need someone to take care of the garden, watch the house when I'm at the university, and help me with daily tasks. It's not complicated. What I offer is housing, food, and a fair salary." The young man felt something inside him pause. The offer was so direct, so simple, that for a second it felt unreal. "Housing?" he asked carefully, lowering his voice as if afraid that saying it aloud might make it vanish. "Yes, there are plenty of rooms here, and if your mother wants to stay too, she can. It seems fair to me," said the old man, leaning slightly forward. "This place has more than enough space for the three of us." Doña Carmen said nothing, but her eyes gleamed slightly. She placed a hand on her lap and clasped it with the other. "I'm willing to work very hard," said Julian, not daring to look at him directly. "I have no doubt," Don Horacio replied, getting up from the armchair with effort and taking his cane. "I'll show you the house." They walked down a wide hallway with old tiles. There were closed rooms, some with a musty smell and others with windows wide open. The garden was an orderly jungle. Bougainvillea climbed the walls, and at the far end there was a rusty iron bench in front of a dry fountain. "It's yours if you want it," said the old man, looking at the garden as if he were speaking of an inheritance, not a job. His mother walked silently along the edge of the grass with careful steps, as if afraid to dirty something. Julian, on the other hand, stood still, eyes fixed on the fountain, feeling that the air in that place was heavier, slower, more serene. "My wife had that bench made. She always said she wanted to die sitting there, looking at the stars," the man said in a low voice. "In the end, she died in the hospital, but I still come here some nights to sit. One gets used to being alone, but that doesn't mean it's good." They returned to the living room, and Don Horacio served coffee in mismatched cups. There was no sugar, but it was warm, thick, like the silence that enveloped them. "If you decide to stay, you can bring your things tomorrow. There's no rush," the old man said, crossing one leg with effort. "Clara will show you which room you can use. And don't worry about the paperwork. Everything will be in order." "Thank you, sir," said Julian, his voice tight, eyes fixed on his cup. "You can call me Don Horacio," the man replied, lifting his cup slightly in the air as if to toast something yet to be born. That night, the young man and his mother slept in their old home, but the air already felt different, as if something had broken in the routine that tied them to dusty streets and waterless nights. Before sleeping, Doña Carmen caressed the photograph of her late husband. Her fingers trembled slightly. "He would be proud of you," she whispered. Julian did not respond. He stared at the leaky ceiling, listening to the creak of the wind. It wasn't about luck. It never had been. But for the first time in a long time, he had the feeling of having opened a door that wouldn't close soon. And deep in his chest, between fatigue and fear, something ignited. The air had a different weight in that house. It wasn't just the garden's humidity or the accumulated dust in the hallway corners. It was a different calm, one Julian didn't know. Accustomed to the market's bustle, to impatient honking, to the shouts from street food stalls, the silence of Don Horacio's residence felt like a constant kind of echo. The first morning they woke up there, his mother rose before dawn. She made no noise. She sat at the edge of the mattress with her hands in her lap, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was all a dream. Julian, in the bed next to hers, watched without moving. The light from the garden cast shadows on the wall, and for a few seconds they only heard the faint hum of the refrigerator, something they hadn't had in years. The house had a soul. The young man felt it from the moment he walked through the kitchen looking for coffee. Every corner held traces of another life. A scratched piece of furniture with initials, ceramic plates with hand-painted designs, jars labeled with dates from decades ago. Nothing seemed new, but everything had a story. Clara, the woman who cared for Don Horacio, was already in the kitchen. She boiled water with cinnamon sticks and sliced bread into thin pieces. She greeted with a tight smile and pointed to the coffee pot without saying a word. She wasn't unfriendly, she just hadn't shared the space in years. Doña Carmen joined her later. Neither asked questions. Clara offered her a knife, and Carmen began peeling potatoes with hands that still remembered the rhythm of the kitchen. Julian spent the morning pruning the bushes in the backyard. The metal shears were heavy and a bit rusty, but they worked well. The sun wasn't too strong yet, and the smell of damp earth gave him a feeling of inner cleanliness. Each cut was a kind of meditation. Among shrubs and branches, he found a rhythm he hadn't felt since he was a child, when he helped his mother clean the house on Sundays to the sound of the radio. Don Horacio appeared near noon. He walked with his cane, dragging his steps but steady. He observed the young man's work without saying a word. He simply looked at the garden carefully, as if trying to remember what it looked like years ago. "Not bad," he said finally, sitting on the rusty bench at the back. "It lacks shape, but with time it'll be good as new," the young man replied, wiping his hands on his pants. The old man nodded, without taking his eyes off the freshly cut grass. Then he pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began writing something with a blue ink pen. He didn't offer conversation, and Julian didn't seek it. They shared the silence like sharing a cup of coffee, with respect and a certain complicity. That was the routine that established itself without any agreements. The young man worked from early in the morning, swept the yard, watered the plants, cleaned the exterior hallways. Don Horacio asked for small favors with brief phrases: a visit to the bank, picking up medicine, checking the mail. He never demanded, only asked politely. Julian, for his part, completed every task without expecting praise. Doña Carmen found a place in the kitchen, preparing light meals, organizing the pantry, and speaking little. Clara accepted her presence naturally. From time to time they shared brief stories, forgotten recipes, popular sayings. Though different, both understood the language of women who have lived more than they say. The nights were longer than ever. The young man had dinner with his mother in silence, under the dim light of a bulb hanging from an old chain. They listened to the radio at low volume, a bolero station barely audible through the static. Julian began reading books he found around the house. There was a small library next to the living room, where the shelves groaned under the weight of the volumes. He chose at random old novels, political essays, some personal diaries. He didn't understand everything, but he liked the texture of the paper and the scent of aged ink. Don Horacio noticed. One night, without saying a word, he left a book on the young man's bed. It was a worn copy of The Burning Plain by Juan Rulfo, with annotations in the margins. On the first page, written in firm handwriting, "For Julian, so that he never forgets the land." The young man found it when he returned from his chores. He sat at the edge of the mattress and held the book with both hands for several minutes, as if struggling to understand that someone had thought of him that way. Then he opened it and began to read softly, while Doña Carmen knitted by the window. In the days that followed, the young man felt the rhythm of the house sinking under his skin. It wasn't easy, nor luxurious, but it had a harmony he had never known. Things were in their place. Water flowed from the faucet without having to carry buckets. Food wasn't abundant, but there was always something hot. No one shouted, no one rushed. Even the silence had a kind of music. One afternoon, while gathering dry leaves from the patio, Julian found a wooden swing among the bushes, nearly hidden by branches. The rope was broken, and the seat was sun-bleached. He stopped to look at it. He didn't know whether it belonged to someone who once lived there, or if Don Horacio had put it up out of nostalgia. The old man approached later, leaning on his cane. He stopped beside him, following the young man's gaze. "I put that swing up for a child who never came," Julian didn't respond. Sometimes silence said more than words. The man kept looking at the swing for a long while. Then he walked away without another word, leaving behind the creaking of his cane over the gravel. That night, the young man went back to reading, but something in him had shifted. It wasn't sadness nor joy. It was the certainty that he had entered the life of someone who, like him, had spent years waiting not to be alone. The changes began with a dry cough. At first, it was sporadic. A throat clearing here, a deeper breath there. Julian didn't think much of it. Don Horacio was an old man, and the city's climate, with its constant dust, polluted air, and abrupt temperature changes, affected even the youngest. But as the weeks passed, that cough became more insistent, harsher. It crept into the early hours, breaking the silence that reigned among the old walls of the house, like a clock counting down an invisible deadline. One night, the young man heard that the coughing wouldn't stop. He crossed the hallway with cautious steps, stopped in front of the old man's door, and knocked softly with his knuckles. "Are you all right, Don Horacio?" he asked from outside, his voice barely raised. "Yes, son," he replied hoarsely, barely audible on the other side. "Just an old throat," he murmured, with a chuckle that ended in another coughing fit. But the young man was not reassured. The next morning, he found him on the garden bench, wrapped in a knitted wool blanket, paler than ever and staring at the sky as if trying to remember something. The half-finished coffee trembled between his aged fingers. The man said nothing about his condition or his discomfort, but Julian decided to go to the pharmacy. He bought syrup, throat lozenges, even herbal teas that his mother prepared carefully and brought to the library. For a few days, he seemed to improve. He smiled a bit more, even made a couple of jokes at dinner. But it was a brief illusion. The body had already begun to shut down, doing so with the dignity of someone who had lived a lot, but not completely, like a lamp that no longer fights the darkness, only accompanies its arrival. One afternoon, as the sun was already setting behind the treetops, Julian found him sitting in the library. The desk lamp cast a golden light over his thin hands, which silently flipped through a photo album. He wasn't crying, but something in his eyes held the clarity of someone who had accepted that the end was near. "Did you ever want to leave this place?" the young man asked, leaning against the doorway with his arms gently crossed. "Many times," Don Horacio replied without looking up, running his index finger over a black and white photo. "But I always found excuses to stay," he added, his voice barely a breath. Several seconds passed in silence. Only the rustling of the pages and the distant song of a bird blended with the smell of old paper. "And why didn't you go?" the young man asked, his gaze tracing a crack in the floor. "Because this house, even if it didn't give me everything, gave me something," the old man said, closing the album carefully, as if not wanting to wake what slept inside. "Sometimes the only thing one needs is a place to wait," he added, this time looking toward the window, not at him. Julian didn't respond. He walked over to the bookshelf, picked a random book with uncertain hands, sat nearby in a low chair, and pretended to read it, though his eyes didn't move past the first page. The following weeks were a quiet parade of signs. Don Horacio began to forget small things, where he left his keys, what day it was, whether he had eaten. He would lose his words when speaking, and sometimes stop mid-sentence, as if his thoughts had fallen along the way. Clara noticed first, then Doña Carmen, but no one said anything aloud. One afternoon, Julian found him standing in front of the swing, staring at the air as if hearing a voice he couldn't. "Do you remember someone in that swing?" he asked softly. "Yes," he said, without turning, even though they were never really there. The garden filled with silence. The birds had flown elsewhere. The decision to take him to the doctor became inevitable. Julian took the initiative, helped by Clara, who found the necessary papers in the desk drawers with the skill only years of service to the same master can bring. The diagnosis was serious. Chronic respiratory failure accompanied by mild cognitive deterioration. There was no cure, only treatment to slow the inevitable. The man received the news with stoic calm, like the final note of a symphony he had already learned to hear in his head. "I don't want hospitals," he said one night as Doña Carmen served tea. "I prefer to stay here, to die in my house, with my books, my plants, and my ghosts." Julian watched him silently. He didn't know what to say, but it wasn't necessary. From that point on, their days revolved around the care of the old man. Julian helped him up and down the stairs, monitored his medications, managed his meals. Every small routine was a way of holding him up without him noticing too much. His mother supported him as much as she could, although her back no longer allowed her to lift weight or stand for long. Clara, always discreet, kept the house spotless, and when needed, she would sit and read aloud to Don Horacio, who could no longer follow the words clearly. No one said it aloud, but the entire house began to prepare for the farewell. One night, the young man couldn't sleep. He went down to the library and found the lamp still on. Don Horacio was asleep in the armchair, his cane resting on the table, a blanket over his legs. Julian approached carefully, covered him better, and turned off the light. Before leaving, he noticed an open envelope on the table. He didn't want to read it, but one line stood out in large letters, written in black ink. "What I have, little or much, I leave to the one who gave me peace without asking anything in return." The young man felt a lump in his throat. He sat in the other corner of the room, in the dim light, and waited. He didn't know exactly what he was waiting for, but he didn't want the silence to be alone. Outside, the night stretched like a warm sheet over the city. The wind played with the branches, and the moon spread its light through the dusty, stained glass windows of the ceiling. Julian rested his head against the wall, eyes open toward the darkness. He had made no promises, but true promises need no words. He had decided to stay, and he would, until the end. Death came without warning. No drama, no noise. Just a sigh that dissipated through the room's curtains as the night slowly unraveled over the rooftops of Coyoacán. Julian found him at dawn. He had slept in the library, as he had on many nights since Don Horacio had begun to decline. He woke up with the first birdsong, walked silently to the adjacent room, and gently knocked on the door. There was no answer. He entered. The old man lay in bed, covered up to his chest, with his eyes closed and a peaceful face. One hand rested on an open book, Masked Days by Fuentes. Beside him, the cane leaned against the wall, as if still needed for dreaming. The young man did not cry immediately. He sat beside him and held his thin, cold hand. He remained like that for long minutes, in a silence that enveloped everything. He felt no fear, nor guilt. Only an absence slowly settling in with implacable slowness, like the dust that settles on things no longer used. Doña Carmen arrived shortly after, guided by the intuition mothers have to sense loss. Clara asked nothing. She simply made coffee, more bitter than usual, and cleaned the room meticulously, as if the act itself could erase the sadness from the walls. The wake was discreet, barely a dozen people, most university colleagues, older men, with calm voices and nostalgic gazes. One of them, whose last name was Iturriaga, if Julian remembered correctly, said a few words before the closed casket. He spoke of Don Horacio's academic legacy, his critical thinking, his love for books and students. The burial was brief. The sky was overcast, but it didn't rain. The young man cast the first handful of dirt with his bare hands. 2 days later, he received a visit from the lawyer. His name was Eduardo Lozano, and he dressed soberly, dark suit, grey tie, and a leather briefcase. His tone was neutral, unadorned. He carried the documents sorted by date, type, and seal. It took him just a few minutes to explain everything. Don Horacio had left a will registered before a notary 3 years ago and recently modified. In it, he named Julian Reyes, his trusted worker, as the sole heir. The house, the land, a bank account with modest but decent savings, and the contents of the library all passed to his name legally and irrevocably. The young man listened without moving. He did not nod or show surprise. He only lowered his gaze to the printed pages and took a deep breath. "And his family?" he finally asked. He had no direct descendants nor living siblings. some distant relatives in the north, but nothing formal. Mr. Santillan was very clear he considered you the only person he saw as family in his final years, said the lawyer. Doña Carmen, sitting in the chair next to him, sighed heavily. There were tears in her eyes, but not of sadness. It's not the money that weighs on me, said Julian, clenching his fists. It's the responsibility. I don't know if I deserve it. The lawyer closed the folder with a solemn gesture. Deserving something doesn't always mean you asked for it. Sometimes it's about having been there, he replied. He left without another word, leaving the documents on the dining table. In the following days, the young man walked through the house as if he were an accidental guest. He touched the door frames, opened drawers with reverence, reread forgotten letters. He found old black and white photos, letters with no sender, objects he didn't understand. Everything smelled of a life lived in silence. His mother, for her part, tried to convince him to accept what life was finally offering. He chose you, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to, she said one night while knitting by the window. I just did what anyone would have done, Julian replied, still looking at a page of a book he wasn't reading. No, son, not just anyone stays. Not just anyone stays and accompanies. Silence fell between them, but this time it was warm. One morning, after cleaning the garden, Julian sat on the old iron bench where he had so often seen Don Horacio contemplating the leaves. The swing was still there, now hung with new ropes that he himself had replaced. He didn't know why he had done it, perhaps so it wouldn't die completely. He held in his hands the book the old man had left on the bed. The pages were marked with phrases underlined by hand. One of them read, "One dies when one no longer belongs to anyone." Julian closed the book and looked up at the overcast sky, and finally, some tears fell. He remained there, feeling that, for the first time in a long while, the earth beneath his feet was no longer crumbling. Life seemed to have found a quiet course. Julian watered the garden at dawn, had coffee with his mother under the eaves where the bougainvilleas grew, and in the afternoons sat reading on the iron bench that still held the shape of Don Horacio's absent presence. The house no longer felt foreign. The floors, once cold and distant, had grown accustomed to his steps. Even Clara, who still visited some days to help with cleaning, now greeted him with a young Julian, full of familiarity. But calm is no guarantee. And in Mexico City, storms don't always arrive with clouds. One morning in March, when the heat was just beginning to creep through the window frames, the young man found a sealed envelope with an official letterhead in the mailbox at the gate. He opened it without hurry, without suspicion, like someone expecting ads or a pending bill. But as he read the first lines, the paper began to tremble in his hands. Court summons, inheritance claim, plaintiff, Rafael Santillan Fernandez. The last name sounded vaguely familiar. The first name, not so much. The words sank into his mind like stones in a shoe. His mother found him in the kitchen, the envelope still in his hand and his gaze fixed on the table. "What is it?" she asked, placing a plate on the drying cloth. Julian didn't answer right away. He handed her the document with a slowness that said it all. She took it, read it with a furrowed brow, and upon reaching the end, let out a sigh that wasn't of surprise, but of confirmed intuition. "I knew something like this would happen," she said, placing the paper on the table carefully, as if it still burned. "The dead can't defend what they leave, and the living, sometimes, don't know how to receive it." Rafael Santillan Fernandez didn't take long to appear. He arrived in a light suit that looked freshly pressed, sunglasses he didn't remove even upon entering the garden, and an attitude that mixed friendliness with disdain. Accompanied by a young lawyer with a flawless face and rehearsed confidence, he showed up at the house on a mild afternoon, knocking on the door as if it were a social visit. "Mr. Julian Reyes?" asked the lawyer, raising an eyebrow as he pulled a leather folder from his briefcase with precise fingers. "That's me," said the young man, wiping his hands with a dirty rag hanging from his belt, still marked with sap from trimming the hedge by the gate. "My client, Mr. Santillan, is here to resolve a legal matter regarding the property you currently occupy." the lawyer continued, with a neutral gaze that didn't quite reach courteous. Raphael, behind him, stepped forward, smiled with a false expression, and extended his hand affectedly, as if it were a ceremony. "Pleased to meet you. I come in good terms. We don't want problems, just clarity," he said, with the polished voice of someone who has rehearsed that phrase far too many times. Julian did not shake his hand, nor did he show hostility. He looked at him in silence, dirt still under his nails and sweat trickling down his neck. "Mr. Horacio Santillan was his great-uncle," explained the lawyer, opening the folder like someone unsheathing a weapon with bureaucracy. "It appears that, before passing away, he made modifications to his will that were not properly reported, and we are therefore in the process of contesting it." Julian lowered his eyes to the papers without touching them, pressed his lips, and looked up again just as Raphael added, letting the words fall with carefully measured gentleness. "They say there were irregularities, that someone might have influenced his final decisions," he said, with a voice so kind it hurt more than an open accusation. The young man clenched his jaw. At that moment, his mother stepped through the main door with a firm stride, still wearing her apron, and approached the group without hesitation. "Don Horacio was not alone," she said, locking eyes with Raphael with calm firmness. "He was cared for, accompanied. No one forced him into anything. If he left this house behind, it's because that's what he wanted." Raphael looked at her for a moment over his sunglasses, evaluating her like an object in an antique display case. His smile remained, but his eyes were still empty. "I don't doubt it, ma'am. But it's the law that must decide that," he finally said. The wind gently stirred the leaves of the freshly trimmed hedge. No one moved for a few seconds. The tension didn't explode, but remained suspended, like dust in the air before settling. Raphael turned slowly toward the gate, and his lawyer followed. "We'll be seeing each other soon," said the young lawyer, without tone. "Surely," Julian replied, without taking his eyes off the gate as it closed. When they were alone, Doña Carmen exhaled the breath she had been holding. The young man folded the rag in his hands and put it in his back pocket, as if folding it could also contain the rage. The threat wasn't loud, but it had just knocked on the door. For weeks, the house began breathing uncertainty again. Julian avoided the neighbors' gazes, some of whom had started murmuring when they saw him walk by. To many, he was just a humble young man who, from one day to the next, had inherited a modest but significant fortune. And now he was being accused, without openly saying it, of having taken advantage of a lonely old man's vulnerability. His mother did her best not to show concern, but her nights filled with insomnia. The trial was imminent, and with it, the possibility of losing everything. The state assigned them a public defender, an older man with a provincial accent who reviewed the documents with skepticism, but soon understood that there was no fraud, no manipulation, no deceit. The will was valid. The signatures were authentic. The timelines matched. "You have the law on your side, son," he said, adjusting his glasses while reviewing a clause. "And is that enough?" Julian asked, arms crossed, staring out the window. The lawyer looked at him with an expression that mixed compassion and resignation. "It's enough not to lose, but not always enough to convince." The day before the trial, Julian made a decision. He got up before dawn, walked through the still dark garden, and sat on the bench. He stayed there for hours, watching the sun slowly tint the leaves, the wall, the flowers. Then he went into the house and made coffee. When his mother came downstairs, he was already waiting with a folder on the table. "What are you going to do?" she asked, still in her robe, rubbing her eyes. "I'm going to give everything up," he replied. Doña Carmen stood still. It took a moment to process what she had just heard. "Are you crazy?" she said. "I don't want to be remembered as the one who stole from a dying old man," he replied, his voice dry. "I'm not going to let them soil what was real. But Horacio chose you because he respected you, and I will keep respecting him. That's why I'm going to leave," the young man stated. At the hearing, Julian signed his voluntary renunciation of the inheritance. He only requested payment equivalent to the years worked at the house, just enough not to leave empty-handed. Raphael accepted immediately, savoring the victory like fine wine. The judge gave him 30 days to vacate the property. No one looked at him with gratitude. The courtroom was filled with silences that hurt more than any word. That night, upon returning home, Julian said nothing. Doña Carmen made an herbal infusion and left it on the table, untouched. She sat in her chair and began to knit, but the needles trembled in her hands. "Maybe you did the right thing," she finally murmured, her eyes moist. "I don't know," said the young man, while picking up the leaves from the garden one last time. "I just know I didn't want to feel ashamed sitting on that bench again." The return was harder than the farewell. Returning to the old tin room in San Lorenzo was like stepping into a worn-out photograph someone had forgotten in the back of a drawer. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. The shared hallway smelled of dampness and reheated food. The roof was still rusted. The door creaked just as it always had, only this time the silence wasn't a pause between two lives but the echo of what would not return. Doña Carmen sat on her old stool, observing the cracks in the wall with a resigned expression, but without complaint. She didn't ask why they hadn't fought harder, or why they hadn't waited for another trial. She only asked that the boxes be left near the wall, where they wouldn't be in the way. Then she started sweeping the dirt floor, as if the dust could swallow the memory of that lost house. The money they received barely covered the first expenses. Julian found work thanks to Don Aurelio, one of Don Horacio's former neighbors, who had heard about the renunciation and didn't consider him guilty of anything. He offered him a job maintaining gardens in several houses in the neighborhood. Stable work, though poorly paid. He accepted without hesitation. He returned to handling shears, pruners, shovels, and to feeling the earth under his nails. His body readjusted to the weight of the sun on his back, to long days and the smell of damp weeds. It wasn't a false return, but neither was it progress. It was floating with his forehead barely above the water. His mother aged suddenly. The nights were long, and her silences no longer had the same consistency. Sometimes she talked to herself, remembering things that had never happened. Other times she spent the afternoons by the window, knitting without looking at the needles, as if knitting memories instead of yarn. One dawn, the young man found her collapsed beside the cot, still wrapped in her shawl and her hands crossed over her chest. There was no need to call a doctor to know her heart was no longer there. She was buried in the San Lorenzo cemetery, next to her husband. Julian spent all that was left from the check on the funeral. He didn't hesitate for a second. The coffin was modest, the flowers few, but he didn't want his mother to say goodbye, surrounded by absence. He spent a year alone with his tools, his books, Don Aurelio's garden, and time withering in his hands. He avoided the streets downtown, old friends, the house in Coyoacan. He became more silent, more observant, but not bitter. It was Don Aurelio who, one afternoon, invited him to a small gathering in his backyard. There was live music, pozole, and lukewarm beer. There he met Magdalena, a slender woman with black hair tied in a tight braid and a clear laugh. She had recently arrived from the state of Veracruz, looking for work as a bakery assistant. She was direct, unadorned, but spoke with gentle words. They saw each other several more times after that. They strolled through the street markets, talked about their days, shared silence with the same ease with which they shared a cup of coffee. Magdalena didn't ask too many questions, and Julian appreciated that. She didn't bring easy stories either, but she told them with humor. After 2 years, they married at the local civil registry, a brief ceremony without a party, but with the tacit promise to care for each other, even if the world offered no guarantees. Soon after, she became pregnant. The pregnancy went smoothly. Magdalena walked every day, ate well, and laughed about the cravings that woke her up at midnight. Julian repaired an old rocking chair and began restoring the room where his mother used to sleep. He painted the walls white and placed a handmade crib crafted by a carpenter friend. Everything was humble, but made with love. The day of the delivery came without alarm. Magdalena said goodbye to him with a long kiss as the ambulance roared down the avenue. The young man, now a man, followed her with his heart in his throat, unaware that he would never again hear that laugh of hers that sometimes sounded like a song. The operation became complicated. The doctor came out with a face worn from exhaustion, still stained with sweat. "We have to decide," he said with a hoarse voice. "We can save her or the baby, but not both," he explained. Time stood still. Julian felt the air turn to shattered glass in his lungs. He closed his eyes and saw Magdalena, that first afternoon beneath the jacaranda tree, with flower-covered hands and a heart as open as a flower. "Save the baby," he said, and his words were both farewell and prayer. He named her Luciana, because that's what her mother would have chosen if she could. Luciana was calm. She cried little, slept deeply, and had dark eyes that seemed too serious for her age. Julian held her with a mix of tenderness and fear. He didn't know how to raise a daughter alone, but he had no choice. Financial troubles returned with force. Diapers, doctor visits, formula. Everything was expensive, more than gardens could cover. Sometimes he ate what his daughter left. Other times he worked double shifts so he wouldn't have to choose between medicine or food. Still, he never considered giving up. Luciana was his beacon, his little iron bench in the middle of the storm. The years passed. The girl was already 5 years old and had a notebook full of poorly cut-out drawings, most with crooked hearts, green clouds, and letters formed with effort. She said that when she grew up, she would be a doctor, or a baker, or an astronaut, or all three depending on the day. She had an easy smile, her mother's skin, and a sensitivity that didn't come from fairy tales, but from the love with which her father had raised her without luxury, but with all possible tenderness. The house they lived in was still the same patched walls, a roof that leaked during the rainy season, a yard of hardened dirt. But it was clean, organized, full of simple details that spoke of effort. Every flower in a pot, every drawing on the wall, every repaired piece of furniture had a story. Julian worked harder than ever. He maintained gardens in 3 different neighborhoods, and in the afternoons helped sweep the elementary school where Luciana had just started kindergarten. He lived in constant fatigue, but he never complained. He had learned that dignity is also preserved in silence. One March afternoon, like any other, he came home from work with a tense back and his neck covered in dust. Upon entering, he found the house unusually tidy, even for his standards. On the dining table, among crayons and crumpled sheets of paper, lay several bills. The man stopped cold. They weren't pesos, they were dollars. He picked them up carefully. They didn't weigh the same, nor did they smell the same. They didn't feel real. They were bond paper bills, printed with school ink and cut out with children's scissors. Next to them, a note written in pink marker. "Daddy, I'm leaving you money so you won't be sad anymore. I love you, Luciana." The man felt the world tighten in his chest. He sat down slowly, the bills still in hand. He looked at them one by one, all identical, all fake, all precious. Then he looked up. His daughter was coming out of the room, her uniform stained with paint and her cheeks full of pride. "Did you see?" she said, pointing at the bills. "I looked up what the most expensive money was, and it's those. Now you don't have to work so much." Her father couldn't respond. He just hugged her, tightly, as if he had to protect her not from the world, but from her own innocence. He cried without making a sound. He cried for the tenderness, for the helplessness, for having come so far with so little, and for that simple, pure moment that reminded him of everything that was worth it. A week later, the letter arrived. A white envelope, no letterhead, addressed to his full name. Inside, an official notification. The supposed heir of Don Horacio, Rafael Santillán, had been discovered to be an imposter. He had used forged documents to claim the property. After an extensive investigation, he was arrested for fraud and identity theft. The original will, signed in full consciousness by Don Horacio, was once again valid immediately. Julian didn't know what to feel. He read the same line 3 times without believing it. All assets are to be restored to Mr. Julian Reyes in accordance with the notarized document dated. The process was long. Months of paperwork, appointments, reviews, letters. But when he finally crossed again the wooden gate of the house in Coyoacán, he was no longer the young man who had timidly knocked with the iron knocker. He was a man with a daughter by the hand, his face weathered by the sun, a heart full of scars, and a story that now had roots. Sometimes the most valuable things aren't what we inherit, but what we learn to build with empty hands and a full heart. This story is not about wealth, but about dignity, love, and second chances. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about your family, your struggles, or simply brought a tear or a smile, then I invite you to like it, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to continue discovering stories where the simplest things become the most profound. Thank you for being here. I send you a warm hug and see you in the next story.